So since I've got my light, really enjoying the light-themed chats we've been having, I've been thinking about all of the other lights there are in the world and all the ones that I could have bought. Panels, tubes. I mean, I ended up getting a cob light. What the purposes of all of these sizes and shapes of lights, especially the LEDs these days? A lot of them are like consumer level at this point. A lot of people I know buy LED panels or cubes or bricks. What am I missing? If I don't get those, is there an all-rounder of all of these sizes and shapes? Like, what is the purpose of all of these different varieties of consumer level and professional LED lights? Because there are so many, which obviously now I'm aware of now that I've bought one. Hang on, but first, we have things to discuss. I haven't flicked Kim's speaking switch on yet, so he's not going to talk until I finish my sentence. I finished the exercise, my epic Instagram content account at EthanSteeleDP. Like and subscribe.
And it should also soon be in a community post, I believe.
It shall soon be in a community post when I compress the photos because they're too big.
Big light, big photo.
Big light, big photo. It went really well. I'm really pleased with it. I'm actually very happy with the way it turned out.
Out of curiosity, what exposure settings, what camera exposure and lens exposure settings did you end up with?
Which was the Cine-style locked version. 50-foot candles and 3.5. And again, yeah, it worked out very, very well. I don't know what the dimmer percentage was. For reference, I'm assuming that's what you meant when you commented. Because it came through as dinner percentage, which I...
winner chicken dinner was like a full dinner, was a little
I was thinking to myself, is this a typo or is this just like a really rounded joke that I don't get, which is happening way too often lately? And it was both. So I figured it out. I'm also mixed responses from like friends and loved ones who like aren't involved in shooting for narrative films at all. So like I'll post a photo like that on my Instagram account, and they'll be like, "Oh, what the? Like, what? Why aren't you looking at the camera? And why are you all the way off to the left side? And why is this just a random photo of yourself?" It's really bringing to light just how weird these exercises in context, especially in like a forum like Instagram, and for like individual photos, like photography photos, instead of like when I say, "Oh, I'm just like shooting like a conversation, like in a movie," it doesn't make any sense. So I'm gradually becoming really, really aware the fact that I'm just going to fill this Instagram account with weird-looking photos of myself. But, got to get there somewhere.
But it's a little reminder for me, kind of forgetting how different image making to narrative filmmaking is to kind of regular, everyday, personal image making.
Sorry, folks, if there's a bunch of awkward, delays in this particular recording. We are both having network issues right now, and I could be having hardware issues. I am the only person who knows the context of the things that I'm uploading to Instagram, and the viewer is also the only person, but I am the only person I did. So I'm shooting it like I'm making an individual shot from a narrative short or like a feature or like a film or anything. Whereas anyone who has a normal light and goes, that is just an image, like in isolation, that serves its own purpose, which is why it looks so weird. Like it isn't like a studio, like photography photo, a photo that you look at, you're like, oh, yeah, that's just void attached to it, if it makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting one as well, because, I do think although photography and cinematography share a whole lot of technical and aesthetic considerations and choices, there is such a thing as a photography look or photography feel versus a narrative motion picture feel. I think there is that, we've spoken about this in a few classes, but particularly that sense of the open framing.
Yeah.
How a lot of still photography is designed to be viewed in singular isolation, as in the image you are looking at contains all of the message, communication.
Yeah.
Whereas cinematography is about the sequence, like no single frame, no single dot lives in isolation, and we want to set up that sense that yes, there was a before, there is an after.
Now that I think of it, I think that a lot of mainstream understanding of cinematography, like on especially social media and YouTube and stuff, is really focused on instances where cinematography or an individual shot kind of does contain all of the information that it needs to have, and all of the it works as its own singular organism. It's hyper focused on that, which I think if you watch any video on Instagram or YouTube called the epic cinematography of, I don't know, like a Film Bro movie. It is all of the shots that are just, that's why the silhouette shot is so popular with like aesthetic film Instagram accounts, because normally they kind of work as their own individual organism, if that makes sense, which I think is kind of bad for overall understanding of what cinematography actually is. But I also don't know anything. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
I think it's a bit like, how much of a sense of an image, a composition do you get if we chop it up into a jigsaw puzzle and just leave one puzzle piece?
Not much. And that's what the one that isn't like focused on these grand epic vignettes, but instead just like conversations and interactions and drama. Taking one shot from that, just like leaving an individual puzzle piece out and just looking at that in isolation.
There should be an awareness amongst beginning cinematographers that not every frame, not every setup can or should be epic, because if everything is epic, then nothing is epic. There is no difference. There is no contrast.
If you're always moving, you're never moving.
Yeah. So I think that there are certain times when I've been talking to both directors and actors and kind of going, can we find some reason to move your character over to XYZ point in space? No kind of aesthetic reason necessarily. No kind of like that wow factor reason. I just need something to move from here to here in order to be able to connect it for the next stage of the coverage and staging. So I think of it as a little bit like transit stages in cycling, Tour de France.
Oh, all right.
So towards the latter stages of that race, they have a lot of sprint stages. And so some of the stages aren't timed. They're literally just to transport all the riders from one location to the next exciting location.
Oh, okay.
So at times, I try and avoid it, but at times it's just like no easy way around it. You just need like a transit setup to get from point A to point B. No need to have like a deep kind of motivation for it. No need to have like a deep kind of symbology to it. Just like,
I kind of got caught in the trap, which is weird because I was actively trying to shake it off while it happened. But like the first thing that I like properly shot in JMC was a music video where we had a really good idea of how it looked, how I wanted every single shot to look. There wasn't much mind for continuity or a sense of space, and I'm willing to justify that like it worked very, very well. It's meant to be like a dream sequence, and it worked pretty well in my opinion. And then the second I did my narrative short, I figured out how to articulate my own issue with the way that I shot it. I think my shot composition is fine. I think my lighting is fine. I think that the way that I've framed things is fine in individual bits. I look at stills of the short and I go, oh yeah, this looks good. I watch it and none of it comes together. I like the way that I've shot it. I don't like the way that those shots come together, which I think is kind of the consequence of what we're talking about, like the idea that sort of every shot needs to be its own organism, when if I had been simply thinking about all of them in sequence instead of thinking about what they would all individually look like, then it might have worked out better. So we get to the light talk now? Sorry, after that digression, I was just thinking about when I was choosing a light to buy, my first instinct was to get an LED panel, but then I got the cob light. I was thinking about what we talked about. I had it recommended to me by one of the fellow Cinequality Discord people, so it done quite well. Now that I've bought the cob light, I'm just thinking about how would my life be different if I had bought a panel light or a tube or a brick? What makes LED panels so popular among amateur like cinematographers and image makers? What am I missing? What's the big idea with all these shapes and sizes?
Go and ask a chef, what's the one knife I should buy? And secondly, can I get away with a career as a chef with only one knife?
Because the answer will be no.
So
or will it?
I think it comes back to something we started out with last episode. Like, what do you actually need the light to do? And I'm not talking about the light fixture, but the actual emitted light.
Yeah, I mean, this is what we discussed last time. So we've got our rundown of that information.
The single light fixture is a bit artificial in a professional environment. Than a single light fixture, although adaptable and flexible in the way you can change how it behaves through various modifiers. At a certain point, A, you're going to want more than one source. And B, how often do you do XYZ modification? How long does that modification take you? How long does it take you to disassemble said modification, and in the end, is it worth having to go through all that extra time and effort every single time because something that another type of fixture, another size and shape might do more readily out of the box with less modification?
Like if you were to use like an LED panel, like a particularly big LED panel, and all you're going to do is book lights, based on what we talked about last time, an LED panel is kind of like a quick book light, isn't it? Pointed at a wall.
I think also I want to distinguish here, like there are LED panels and there are LED panels and there are LED panels.
Oh dear.
If you think something like an A5 size, the paper size, there are a lot of beginner enthusiasts to them. That's a very, very big fixture because they're thinking something that they're going to stick on top of their camera.
Yeah.
And I totally get that. Like I wouldn't be very comfortable putting something like an A5 size on top of the camera. It just makes it very, very wieldy.
Yeah.
But compared to like your booklight exercise, not really going to do it.
No, not at all.
Because you're starting with such a small source and because it's not focused, in order to get any kind of reading of the light output on your bounds, you're going to have to put it very close. But then as you put it very close, you're not going to you're not going to illuminate the whole bound. So not really going to work for that purpose, does it?
No, not at all. So it's still like a lot about the purpose. So it makes sense to me that like the LED panel is very, very popular for like content creators. It is a very, very adaptable, workable, small light with decent output. But that makes a lot of sense.
If we're going to step it up from there, I'll take a little sidetrack. We have alluded to, we should probably do like a more deep dive episode on the principles of soft light, i.e. the diffuse ratio.
Yeah, that's fair enough.
So the softness of a light source being the function of its apparent size, not its absolute size.
Yeah.
And the apparent size being a function of the absolute size in relation to the distance to the subject.
Yeah.
So as long as we maintain the same ratio of absolute size to distance, we get more or less the same diffuse quality, the same shadow definition. So for example, a 1 foot light source at 1 foot away is going to give a similar shadow quality to a 4 foot light source at 4 foot away is going to give a similar shadow quality to a 12 foot source at 12 foot away.
Yeah, and like I shot my little wacky little Instagram post with a 1 meter light source 1 meter away from my face. If that had been a 4 meter light source 4 meters away from my face, it would have looked kind of the same.
Where we do see the difference is in two areas. Further away you move the light source, less light is going to be emitted. So the further away, the darker the light is.
Yeah.
And also lighting a bigger surface to make that bigger size, you're also going to diluting the amount of light that you start with. So it's kind of like a double whammy.
Damn, it is a shame.
All of what I'm saying is that given that we compensate for the exposure, if we take a larger source and move it further away so that we get the same amount of light reaching the target. For yourself, did you find it was a bit of a challenge kind of choosing, I know roughly what kind of ratio I want, but do I pick a 1 meter wide source, a 1.1 meter, 1.3 meter, 1.7 meter, like whatever? I think
that definitely was like a bit of a concern. I think, especially considering even now, I think the bulk of my practice has happened now. And like I know that I'm probably not going to be practicing with huge sources. So I've only really used sources that are close by, very close by, so I can keep the diffuse ratio pretty decent and quite small. Definitely was a bit of a toss-up. Like I think I mentioned it last week, like I was just thinking, what is the point of a larger source if I can just do the same thing with a smaller source that's closer by, and therefore with less light and less fiddling.
How did you find yourself initially when you wanted to choose a softness, when you wanted to choose a different level of diffuse quality? Did you find yourself trying to pick a size first? Did you try finding yourself picking a distance first? How did you find that process?
I normally chose a size first based on like what was available. And then I think you find a bit of a middle ground. Like if your size doesn't match your distance perfectly, then you can change the size a little bit or like figure out the size of your room. But I have never done anything like super huge. Like it's been like 1 meter to 2 meters for me, maybe 4 max.
What kind of speeds up the process for me? I generally tend to think ratio first, then size, and then comes distance.
Oh yeah, I always think ratio first. That's my.
What helps a lot is that there are standard sizes of modifiers.
Mm-hmm.
I think we went through them. Do you remember them?
I know we went through them. I don't know if I remember them. We're test driving our as we chat, kind of like taking notes situation, dear viewer. So like there'll be a good chance that not everything will be forgotten by the end of the episode, as it normally is.
By the way, what's the next ISO up from 250 fail?
We'll get there. Wait, the next one up from 250?
Yeah.
Is it 320?
It is indeed.
Excellent. See?
Slow fail.
I can do some things sometimes.
So, standard sizes, as with a lot of different things in the industry on the cinematography side, there's really only a handful of numbers you need to remember, and then it's multipliers of that.
Mm-hmm.
So if you can remember 1, 2, 3,
I can remember those numbers.
Then we're just gonna multiply. I should remind everyone that in the film industry we work in Imperial.
Yeah.
Because life isn't complicated enough for anyone coming from a metric background. We can't make it too easy.
Wait, hang on. What do they?
Not be fun.
Did you use metric as you grew up?
Yeah.
So you learnt metric. No, so you had to learn Imperial and English.
Ooh, this just goes, we need the Imperial march right now.
A cease and desist from Disney. Because we're so huge.
That's a side discussion again, but I do find that within the working distances, we find ourselves most of the time, Imperial actually makes more sense because it's based on body measurement, and with the level of precision we need, depending on how you look at it, isn't a lot. We can express more fractions through a base 12 system than we can through a base 10 system. So a foot has 12 inches.
Oh, yeah, that's fair enough. Yeah.
So we can easily express 1/2, 1/3, 1/4, 1/6 before we have to go to kind of really odd fractions.
Yeah.
Whereas with a base 10 system, we can do halves and fifths before we have to go into decimal places.
Yeah.
And when you think about it, are you more likely to want to know something divided in quarters or thirds than in fifth?
Quarters and thirds by a mile.
Yeah. So that fifth that we're missing out on in the Imperial system, base 12, is less of an issue than having to go into the typical example, like thirds and 2/3 in metric is just a nightmare, isn't it? You just got to decide, at what point did you stop counting decimal places?
Literally.
Yeah. Whereas in Imperial, that's either 4 inches or 8 inches.
You're turning me pro-Imperial right now. This is getting bad.
And at a certain point, distances become abstract, right?
Yeah.
And we also don't really need millimeter precision.
Yeah.
And that kind of shows the background of where Imperial comes from. It's just kind of pre and up to early industrial.
Right. Okay. Yeah. No, it's it's when people could just make stuff up.
Yeah.
When they were more abstract and more weird.
1, 2, 3 would be in feet, 1 foot, 2 foot, 3 foot. So the next modifier up is the second one, doubled.
I'm going to put that in the thumbnail now. You've been thumbnailed.
Blurred out. The second of those 3 doubled would give us how many feet? So 1, 2, 3. Next number.
So the second of the 3 doubles 4.
Yeah.
Right.
4. Yeah. And then we're going to double the previous, which gives us.
So you just keep doubling
up to point. Of course, we can't make it too easy. So we got 1 foot, 2 foot, 3 foot, 4 foot. The next size is going to be the previous size doubled.
Right. Okay. So 1 foot, 2 foot, 3 foot, 4 foot, 8. Wait, no. What? So the next. Okay, 6 foot. Right. The previous size doubled. 6 foot, 8 foot, 12 foot.
And then we're breaking
foot. Yeah. Okay.
And jump to 20 foot.
Right. Okay. It all makes sense now. It took me a really long time, but it makes sense.
So that's how I think about it. Like in terms of I pick a ratio, let's say 1 to 2, and go, okay, I'm going to do that with a 4 foot. So I'm putting that at 8 foot distance, for example.
Right.
Or I'm kind of thinking, I want to like this with a 12 foot 1 to 1. Well, that ends up then at 12 foot. So the distances aren't as random as they may seem because you've got a limited amount of sizes. It also means that you've got a limited amount of distances to match different ratios.
Right. 1 to 2 is pretty hard, isn't it? I know it's only hypothetical. I'm just thinking about diffuse ratio.
I think the useful to start differentiating shadow definition from direction.
Oh, okay.
So there is a point where we can see if we move the light source, the actual shadow that it cast will move when we move the light source without the outline of that shadow necessarily being defined razor sharp.
Right.
So when you get into the kind of 1 to 2, 1 to 4 kind of territory, then you get a lot more directionality. You aren't necessarily getting the razor sharp, like seeing every strand of hair in the shadow definition.
Huh, okay, so it's a soft hard light, not much. It's not
I guess we call it softer.
Softer, but not soft.
Fair enough. Is that okay? So that's then spelled SOFTEUURGH. Is that the correct spelling?
I don't know. To be honest with you, I have absolutely no clue.
Rather than soft or hard.
I'll let you figure that one out. It's a bit esoteric for me.
Well, let me see if I can try and demonstrate that. So the typical kind of shadow definition test with your kind of Mark 1 light evaluation tool.
Yes. The little hand or an egg.
Yeah. The typical diffuse quality test would be a finger in front of your palm. So can you see, you can actually see my finger shadow move across.
I've never considered that.
If I move closer, much closer to my source, here, can you see we see much less? Yeah. I'm about half the distance that I am here. Here you can actually see the finger shadow, but would you call it defined?
No.
But as I move my finger, the shadow actually moves. Whereas here we don't really see much of anything, do we?
None, basically.
So, I mean, technically you would still call it soft, but it shows the direction of the light source much more than the one over here.
Yeah, okay. I get you now, right.
At those points, like the lower diffuse ratios can be quite useful when you want actual more directionality.
Yeah, so if we bring that back to the kind of size and shape conversation, that kind of brings me to the thought of LED panels, for example, which I think we've discussed. Why do I only forget names for things when we're recording and never when we're actually just like talking regularly?
No pressure?
What a nuisance. Yeah. The fold-out, JMC had fluorescent versions of them, the big fold-out flat sources. Take out the fluorescent and you replace it. We've discussed LED alternatives to them because the fluorescent ones are very dated nowadays.
Oh, okay. Yeah. The generic name is just fluorescent, but the brand name we're looking at is Kino Flow.
That's it. The Kinos. I think we've discussed those kind of being used as... In the past, we discussed them, and I'm assuming by extension, like similar flat panel shaped fixtures, kind of being used as their own like diffused source, because a lot of the time diffusion is used to even out the spread of the light, less for removing output and softening, but just evening out. It's evening it out, is what I'm trying to say, which is why that kind of like works as an instant booklight in some scenarios. Do you think LED panels are popular because they generate a similar look to a diffused source, or is that complete garbage?
In essence, like if you take something like a fluorescent source and you just look at the subject side, so what the subject sees, and in a dark room with a really bright source like that, can you really tell how deep that fixture, that source is? I.e., can you tell if there is an actual softbox tinted dome behind it or whether it's just a flat panel?
No, you can't, not in that context.
The advantages of a panel light is that you lose that tint dome of a softbox behind it.
They're popular because you don't need to take up as much space as well.
And also, you don't need to assemble the softbox to put it on the balance mount cob fixture.
Right, gotcha. Which is also a nuisance. And then that's where we get back to the, what are you using it for? If you have to constantly add, like if you have to tinker with your source, have you got the right one?
Cob point source, and you constantly find yourself putting on like a 2x1 softbox, then at a certain point it becomes a question, is it worth it getting like a 2x1 source that is ready to go, but you don't constantly have to assemble and disassemble a softbox?
That's got me worried now, because I'm going to be using my... Not for softboxes, but I'm going to be using my cob light for... A lot of my experiments now are going to be booklight focused and like large source focused. So,
but that's like where you run into a panel at that size isn't really economical, at least not for a low budget beginning kind of situation. Now there exists, or you can make modular kind of sources. So, for
okay.
example, there's a company called Source Maker in the US
Source
that
maker.
originally took, like the flexible LED tape. It's got a lot of little LEDs on them, and you can tape them onto whatever surfaces to create like a linear strip
Oh yeah,
of LED
the
light.
one that the kids these days are really into. The TikTok lights.
6-7 years ago, when black LED panels, like the flexible ones, kind of really started making their way into the industry, Source Maker made two versions, a 4x4 foot and an 8 foot by 8 foot.
8 foot by 8 foot LED panel. Damn, that would be expensive, wouldn't it? And like a horrible mess to transport and carry and set up and.
Well, if I understand correctly, it was modular, so it was made up of like you connected four 4x4s together to make one 8x8.
I don't mind that. That's not bad. I was also thinking that I have few peers like at JMC who. I don't know if it's more like an exercise for them, but like a decently sized LED panel, even one that's a foot by a foot, is really
define decently sized.
Yeah, sorry, not decently sized. Sorry,
no,
not decently sized.
I'm just curious about your frame of reference.
Most LED panels that I've seen are minuscule, the size of a book, that kind of thing. They make up for their size with their brightness, according to other people, which I don't think is valid. However, a lot of those smaller LED panels, the bigger end of those, the ones that are about a foot by a foot-ish, excellent for people who shoot miniatures and do toy photography and all of that. They are like just so useful and so versatile in that context, and probably as an extension of that, great for experimenting on the small scale with larger sources, if it makes sense. But I don't know how well it translates into the real world once you hit like an 8x8 foot huge flat panel. Like, it's definitely a stand-in for something else. Just because you're using a small LED panel to test a larger source on a small scale doesn't mean you need to translate that to an actual LED panel with human scale, if that makes sense.
Again, it depends on like if you're using it there with no modification, with no diffusion, whatever you want to call it, then yeah, I think you are going to have problems translating it to a bigger scale. But like once you got a rag in front of it, then what's the source?
Once I've got a what in front of it? Sorry, it's kind of like
a rag.
A rag. Well, the rag becomes the source.
Yeah,
fair enough. Again, instant booklight. That's the handy part. You have an 8 foot by 8 foot LED panel. You also have the chance for an 8 foot by 8 foot booklight that is way smaller than a booklight would normally be, which sounds great.
But yeah, I don't know the prices off the top of my head. There are other manufacturers that make similar systems where you get like a 1x4 strip, and then you can tie as many together as you need to make whatever size source you want.
Sounds great. That's very versatile.
Because they tend to be small.
Yeah.
So as you were saying, like 1x1 is a pretty common panel style. 2x2 you see occasionally, but it's still, as far as I'm concerned, that's still pretty small.
Yeah, very small.
Now, where I do find the smaller panel sizes very useful and very interesting is in rectangular shapes rather than square.
Okay. Is that because they can be wider than they are tall?
Yeah, fine. Like generally, when it comes to softness, I'm more concerned about the width of the source than I am the height. And I think there are a couple of reasons for that. I think one, you tend to want to light the face mainly when you light the body.
Yeah.
You tend to want to draw the attention to the face. So lighting kind of be below the chest. I find myself very often wanting to feather the intensity of the bottom. So a lot of the time I'm not even using the bottom. Like if let's say you set up something like a 12x12 or an 8x8 and you set it up floor up to whatever top of the size is. Most of the time I find myself, because we want to draw attention to the face, the head, kind of want the bottom of the subject to fade off in intensity. So if I set up a source that's taller than head height, let's say 12x12 or an 8x8, and most of the time kind of cutting off the bottom half anyway.
Oh, okay.
When you think about it,
so you could just use a smaller source elevated, is what you're saying?
Yes and no.
Okay.
But when you think about it, like everyone loves window light, right?
Yes. Good old south/north light.
What percentage of windows goes right to the floor?
None. Well, no, very few.
Also, that kind of like popping the bottom of a bigger source also makes it feel and behave a little bit more like a window. So when you think about that, then most of the time I'm more concerned about the width of the source than I am the height.
Right.
Now, once you come to that conclusion, that means that you're going to have different diffuse quality in different directions. Once you get a big rectangle, it's going to be softer on the long dimension, and it's going to be less soft. It's going to be harder in the short dimension.
Oh, I'd never thought that you'd be able to detect any kind of difference between hard and soft, like horizontally and vertically. Does that make sense? I've only ever evaluated a light source as it goes like across the face. But like next time I light something with more,
but also isn't that telling something that the width of the source is kind of a bit more important than the height?
It's probably the more noticeable part of it, in my opinion.
Yeah. So you may not necessarily notice it so much in the shadow definition, but where it can become really useful is that the softer the source is, so the wider dimension is going to wrap more than the shorter dimension.
It has more to wrap around as well. It's got the entire face.
So if I do like a horizontal source, it's going to wrap more that way. It's not going to wrap around so much that way. But if I flip it, I get the other behavior. It's going to wrap more that way, but it's not going to wrap so much that way, which can be very useful for edge lights, for example, where you want like an edge quite tall, but you don't necessarily want it to wrap around the front so much.
Right. Doesn't sound like a very common requirement to me.
Yeah. So this is where shapes like a 1x4 is quite useful, because it really gives you that ability to wrap way more in one direction than you can in the other.
In what circumstance would you want to wrap more vertically than horizontally?
It can be useful if you really want the shadow side to fall off. So have you started running into like particularly 2-to-1 ratio, 2-to-1 diffuse ratio? It's almost impossible to get a Rembrandt pattern. You notice that?
Yes. I literally aimed for it the other day and I just couldn't. I kind of gave up. I was like, oh, well, this isn't worth it because it just wasn't really. Do you think it would show up more if I had added more vertical length to my source?
No, I think like you make the width less. So think about it.
Well, I mean, if I shoot. Next thing I shoot, I'll use my little photography diffusion thing. I normally have it lying. I say lying because I always lie. I don't have any stands to rest it on. Sorry. That's why I always say set up.
Lie down.
I'll make sure next time.
Lie down for this shot?
I normally lie the diffusion horizontally, so it's like longer along. But maybe I'll do it so it's quite tall next.
The thing you're going to think about with a soft source and lighting patterns and lighting directions is that you are not getting a single direction in terms of lighting patterns, but you're getting a near edge and a far edge.
So the larger your source is, or like the larger,
the more different patterns it covers.
Right. Oh, okay. So you're not going to get as strong a Rembrandt or a little.
Yeah. So you may find that with a 2-to-1, you're probably going to get something like a split on one end to at least a loop on the other end.
Right.
So if it helps, another reason why this shadow is soft is that, let's say we do have a source that's wide enough to cover, let's say, a split and a loop. You're not just getting the split and a loop, you're getting every single possible shadow pattern in between.
Right, that makes a lot of sense.
So can you imagine if we overlay them on top of each other, it's going to blur out.
So if you wanted a stronger pattern but still wanted a soft-ish source, that's when you might want to do height over width?
Yes, that's one way.
Should I ask what another way is, or is it the whole new can of worms?
It kind of is. But yeah, let's note it down, because you can get a twofer. You can mix diffuse quality in the one source.
Mix them?
In essence, if you create a hotspot that is brighter of a smaller size, then you're also getting a harder source inside the softer source. You're adding some directionality to the bigger source. So think of it as a partially overcast day where you kind of see a bit of the sun through the clouds.
Yeah.
Try that on a day like that versus one where it's completely flat and even, and see how much more direction does that hotspot in the cloud pick up for you.
Right. Okay.
So directionality also means that you're going to get more directionality of your nose shadow.
Right. Okay, so we've run through our diffuse ratio, our size, our shape. Sounds like squares are a bit less preferable to rectangles because the width is generally more important.
Also, on that note, with rectangular sources, I find it easier to create a square if you put two rectangles next each other.
Right.
Whereas trying to make a rectangle out of two squares, I don't know why, but I find that peculiar.
I'll keep that in my mental notes. And now for the final question of the shape and size discussion. What's up with tubes? Just what's up with them? What's the deal with tubes, as Jerry Seinfeld would say?
I think part of it is look at my new toy.
Oh, okay.
I think a lot of it was when the tube style kind of re-emerged, because originally like tubes were everywhere, i.e. fluorescent tubes. That was kind of the LED before LED. In one way, we can say that tubes have re-emerged from a hibernation, and then the shiny new toy LED kind of pushed them to the side.
Oh, right. Was it a short-lived life for the tube then?
No, it was quite a while. Like fluorescent tubes started coming into the film industry in the 1980s, like mid to late 80s.
Oh, okay. But why? What was the appeal?
What made the tubes re-emerge in LED form was RGB.
But don't most LEDs have RGB, or was it tubes first?
Initially, the RGBs were your little kind of on-camera bricks or your little A5 style. They weren't really doing that until you get into like a 2-foot tube or a 4-foot tube. Then that's going to light a bigger area, and they're also going to look prettier as practicals, as props in the background.
Right.
So a tube is an extreme form of a rectangle, right? It really is going to wrap a lot in the length direction. It's hardly going to wrap at all in the thin direction.
Okay, that makes sense. It is basically an extreme rectangle. It's a very good way of putting it. Thank you. That clears a lot of things up. Okay, why tubes, long rectangles?
In a lot of ways, I find single tubes in terms of subject or location lighting, as opposed to being a practical in the background, I don't necessarily find all that useful, because there's such an extreme difference in the wrap in one direction versus the wrap in the other direction.
Right.
In the fluorescent days, we worked around this by building banks of individual tubes into a bigger source. So one fluorescent that I really, really like the shape of is something called an Image 80, which is a 4-foot by 2-foot. It's got 8 tubes.
And this is basically where we get into Kino territory, right? This is kind of what a Kino is.
Image 80 is one fixture from Kino.
Right, okay.
For me, the sizes that I really like are 2-foot by 1.5. You see a lot of 2 by 1.
Just in general, or?
Yeah, so you see a lot of LED panels in the kind of 2 by 1.
Right. Yes, yeah, lots of 2 by 1s.
I find it's just a little bit skinny.
Right.
If I want to use a 2 by 1 as a key light source, I definitely want to put some diffusion on and make it bigger. Not so necessarily so much wider, but a bit still out the other direction a little bit.
Makes sense.
Yeah, I do find that like adding that half a foot to the soda dimension makes them more useful as an unmodified key light source. And I think in a lot of ways it makes sense, because 2 foot by 1.5,
the panel
makes it almost exactly the same size as an A2. If we look at an A2 there, then you see that it does have some width as well as length. It's not like completely skinny.
Yeah.
I do like 4 foot by 1 foot. So that would be the classic 4-bank Kino flow, is about 4 foot by 1 foot. You know, also the skinny, long ceiling fluorescents or ceiling LEDs that you find in office buildings are also 4 foot by 1 foot.
Yeah. So you turn them on their side to get more wrapping that way.
I do find that as an unmodified key light source, again, I find them a bit skinny. So I also like 4 by 2.
Right.
So I think a lot of this is about two things. But one, start thinking about the softness, the wrap in vertical versus horizontal dimensions, or like one dimension versus another, because remember, you're not stuck with having it horizontal or vertical. You could having at an angle as well. The next one is to consider, do you need the full height of a bigger source? One thing I do want you to start exploring there is particularly bigger source that goes all the way to the floor. That means you're going to get a fair bit of uplight.
Right, like beneath here, right?
Not to start, but pay attention to where the nose shadows sit in relation to the nose. For a more neutral, multi-purpose, all-purpose, everyday kind of nose shadow, it feels, and it invokes the N word, it feels more natural to have the nose shadow sit below the nose. You get a drop shadow from the nose. because in nature, most of the available light sources are coming from above.
Right. I have a pitch for an exercise for this. Here it is. Here's my pitch. Like I said, I have my I think it's 2 meter by 1 meter, I think, little photography diffuse thing. I could take 2 photos aiming for the same light pattern on my face, like a loop or a Rembrandt or something with the same diffuse ratio. But I take one where it's flipped on its horizontal side, so it's 2 meters wide, and one where it's flipped so it's vertical, so it's 1 meter wide and 2 meters tall. And just see what the difference is.
I would also recommend trying covering the bottom half.
Covering the bottom half? When it's flipped vertically, you mean? Or
no, in the horizontal.
Oh, okay.
So in that case, I would just to see what it does in terms of like feathering off and like how much of the height dimension do you actually need.
Right. Okay.
I think it's going to be really useful to start like thinking about, rather than just the lateral placement of the nose shadow, start thinking about the vertical placement of the nose shadow as well. And what I find that this is more a personal thing, so do explore it and see where you sit with it. For me, I'm very, very, very careful with uplight.
Right.
And the main reason for that is the nose shadow, because I find that once the nose shadow starts creeping above the tip of the nose, it's very easy to make people look as if they're doing that.
Oh, okay. Weird, isn't it?
So have a little bit of an experimentation with that. This doesn't even need to be a big source, just like even a harder source, like try lighting from below, try to keep like a neutral facial expression and then move the light up and see at some point, almost as if the facial expression changes.
I could literally just point my light at my white wall. One below me, one opposite my face, and one above.
So you want something a bit more directional so that you actually see the shadow move up and down.
Okay.
For me, uplight either has to be very soft and very wrapping, or it has to be for a very specific purpose, character-wise.
Gotcha.
Narrative-wise. And I do find that with the source that goes all the way to the floor, you do get that much uplight that you start moving those shadows up.
Right. Okay. I shall experiment with that. I'm pretty happy with what we've gone through today. To start, we had a little digression about shots working in sequence, the little individual puzzle pieces and how weird my exercises look out of context. As usual, we've gone to what's the light's purpose, if I'm asking about the size and the shape and the FOMO and what am I missing. We've kind of touched on the apparent size, distance of your light, how the diffuse ratio kind of leaves it more or less the same, but with difference in output, fall off, and that kind of thing. On that note, we've kind of discussed size in general, how to measure size in our doubles and doubles and doubles and doubles. 1, 2, 3, 6, 4, 12, and so on. 20. Yeah, that's where it gets weird. And yeah, I learned today that you lose a bit of that lighting pattern as you go beyond like the 1-to-1 diffuse ratio, especially as you wrap width, not height. And then Y tubes, big rectangles. Well, rectangles. Very rectangularly.
Yeah, I think that one is an important one, is to start thinking about soft light, like diffuse quality, not as a one-dimensional thing, but like softer in one direction, less soft in another direction. That's the advantage of a rectangle. But also once you start thinking about like, is the single soft source just a single diffuse quality, we can also start thinking about mixing diffuse qualities in the one source.
Like about
hotspots and gradients and all sorts of fun. So I think very often, like where I start with teaching is let's make it a completely flat, even source, just so we get the hang of the ratio between size and distance. Once we're comfortable, once we get an understanding of that, then we can start mixing in
quirky bits, hotspots, vertical, extremely tall sources that are not that wide. And
so the whole thing about my rappy lighting is about having a gradient or a hotspot.
Yeah, and we'll talk about that sometime in the future, the idea of kind of adding rappy lighting that actually has shape to it, which sounds really interesting to me. Like, I feel like there's a certain look that I've noticed with really, really rappy lighting that I've not quite liked as much as I have. Like, why a lot of people like hard lighting is that it kind of like creates a nice shape. But I like the idea of getting the best of both worlds, killing two birds with one stone. Have we reached a half-decent conclusion at one point, or is this one of the rare times we've done that? Or
I think that is actually becoming more and more common.
Yeah.